Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for having me. I would like to explain something to you about the concept of sustainable diets in nutrition studies. Let me first start with a motivation. Why do we actually want to study sustainable diets in nutrition studies? Because if we would know what a sustainable diet is, we don't need any further research in nutrition studies, but could go on in using it in real life, in real world. But there are a number of questions that still need investigation, which is why we also need to operationalize the concept in the studies that we do. And I have two examples here for you. The first one could be we need still to find out the most sustainable combination of foods or dietary patterns, following, for example, a question, how much animal-based foods are possible in a diet still being sustainable? Another question could be, we want to investigate the implications of achieving one component with respect to other components in sustainable diets. For example, are diets very low in intake of animal-based foods still nutrient adequate? And here you can also see some of the components that we will address. Let me start with a definition of sustainable diet, and this definition goes back to the year 2012 and was published by the FAO. And it says that sustainable diets are those diets with low environmental impacts which contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life for present and future generations. Sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair, and affordable. They are nutritionally adequate, safe, and healthy, while optimizing natural and human resources. This is a pretty complicated definition, and it has been broken down into kind of 4 elements of sustainable diets. And nowadays we also talk about sustainable healthy diets, which is a repetition in itself, but emphasizes this aspect of healthiness also of those diets. And those 4 components are, on the one hand, the nutrition and health component, which you can find here. And here we talk, for example, about nutrient requirements. A sustainable diet has to provide nutrient adequacy so that people leading the diet receive all the nutrients they deserve. Then a sustainable diet is supposed to be food secure and accessible here, but also associated with physical, mental, and social health and well-being in populations at all life stages. So nutrition and health is one of the elements of sustainable diets. The second one is affordability and accessibility. So a diet that is termed sustainable needs to be accessible and affordable to people. The fourth element is the environmental impact. So a sustainable diet should be low in environmental burden, should address biodiversity, low greenhouse gas emissions, low land use, and be favorable for the climate. And the final aspect is the cultural acceptability. So sustainable diets need to respect cultural heritage, tradition, and skills, and should therefore be adoptable by populations. So to understand sustainable diets in nutrition studies, or the concept of sustainable diets in nutrition studies, we secondly need to address what nutrition studies are. And here I'm going to give you an example of an observational cohort study. It's one potential nutrition study, and this links to the examples that I have later on in my talk. So an observational cohort study recruits study participants, study individuals to a study, and conducts a complex baseline assessment. And in that baseline assessment, we collect exposure data, which most of in nutritional studies is dietary intake data. So we collect dietary intake information of each individual in the study. And then over time, we conduct a follow-up to collect the information about incident diseases, so those diseases that newly developed in the study population. To later on analyze if any of the dietary risk factors are associated with disease and with disease incidence. We have a basic explanation. For example, you could categorize the cohort into 2 groups, the one with exposure, so those with the highest fruit and vegetable intake, for example, and those without exposure, those with the lowest food and vegetable intake, you could take a median split, and then you compare disease incidence rates in these two cohorts. And if the ratio, so which is the relative risk, is 1, then you have no association between the risk factor and the disease incidence. If it's above 1, you have an increased risk, and if it's below 1, you have a decreased risk. But very important, you have individual level dietary assessments of all study participants in your study. So how do we collect the dietary data in nutrition studies, which is the next element we need to understand? And here I'm going to give you 2 examples of dietary assessment instruments in those observational studies. The first is the food frequency questionnaire. And you can also already see from the picture that I took, it's one that has been used in that sense, in that way, in the late 90s, actually 1995 to 1998 in the EPIC Potsdam study, which is a prospective cohort study. And I used this older picture. Nowadays, we would use web-based instruments, and they would look a lot different. But the data we work with still are those cohorts that have been started in the late 90s on the early 2000s. So the data we nowadays look at go back to instruments like this. And the main element to understand food frequency questionnaires is that we ask about the frequency of consumption, of intake, of a finite list of foods, and this is just one page here, over the past 12 months. So the study participants is asked how often during the past 12 months did you have any kind of lettuce for this item here at the top. And then the participants answers with frequencies of intake, less than once per month, once per week, and he or she can choose the frequency that the food was consumed. And it's important to understand that the frequency of consumption is the most decisive information we need to explain variation in food intake in a population. We also address portion sizes, but this carries a little bit of information with respect to variation only. The most decisive and the most informative information is the frequency of intake. This questionnaire has 146 items. To give you a little bit an idea of the length of this questionnaire, it's a finite list of foods and includes also small groups, single items like the cucumber here, but also small groups of items that are often exchanged in the diet. And it can have attempts of seasonal intake, which might be interesting with respect to sustainable diets like here raw tomato in summer or raw tomato in winter. So this is the one instrument, and another example of a dietary assessment instrument you can find here is a weight dietary record. This is the instrument we also used in the Donald cohort. Ina Dankwa mentioned it before, that this is the study we are working with at the Bonn side. And here study participants are asked to report the weight quantity of food intake over a given period of time, which is one or few days. And participants need to go through their diet and weigh all the single food items of composite dishes and report the leftovers. So weigh the leftovers also, the foods that have been eaten. And you can see that this is a very detailed instrument. It quantifies food intake. It's open-ended. It inquires about all the food items. Everything that has been consumed can be put in there. Paper and pencil version are now still the versions in use, but we have smartphone-based, smartphone-assisted records also at hand that are used in the newer studies. Here we also have the option to collect additional attributes to foods, like ecologically grown or something, which is sometimes adopted in studies, but not on a regular basis. So now the question is, how can we bring those things together? We have individual level dietary data, and now we want to measure sustainability aspects of those diets in our studies. And when we look at this, what we have, usually we don't have any information about affordability and accessibility. We usually don't collect any information with respect to this, and if this is targeted, then it has to be included in the studies by design. But this is nothing that can be derived on studies that have been ongoing for decades already. And you can see from the cohort studies that I showed to you that we need the prospective settings, the prospective follow-up to actually collect incident diseases. So it's not so easy to start new studies all the time. The second aspect I want to say something about is the cultural acceptability. In this design, this is somewhat implicit in the data because we work with data on actual intakes. In other studies, it needs to be addressed. For example, when you want to derive food-based dietary guidelines or dietary recommendations for populations, then you also need to address the cultural acceptability. But in the design I showed you, this is somewhat implicit in the data. What we have been doing ever since is we talk about nutrient adequacy and disease risk because we can link the data that we collected to food composition tables and we can calculate the nutrients that are provided by the specific diets. We can also link the diets or the dietary intakes to the disease risk, as I've shown you in the cohort studies. And what we nowadays can also do is we can look at ecological footprints of foods and of diets using life cycle assessment and life cycle inventory data. Let me give you some examples. This is from an American study. It's from an American Nutrition and Health Survey, National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. This is what the abbreviation stands for, data from the year 2001 to 2016. And this table tells you something about nutrient intake in this representative survey of children between the age of 1 and 6 years. This is an assessment that goes back to yet another dietary assessment instrument. It's a single 24-hour dietary recall, which resembles very large the weight dietary record, particularly in the detail of assessment. And here, the researchers calculated the population, the percentage of the population that did not meet the dietary reference values. These are estimated average requirements here. So for example, for the nutrient of vitamin E, roughly 70% of the children did not meet the requirements. For calcium, roughly 17% of the children did not meet the requirements. And this can be interpreted in a similar way. So adequate intake here is a different way of looking at recommended dietary intakes. And here, for example, you can see that almost all the study participants did not meet the adequate intake of sodium. The second aspect linking to nutrition and health is the disease risk. And let me give you an example of a meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies here that was published in the year 2017 by Lukas Ringsakel and colleagues. So a number of prospective cohort studies go into this analysis. And I'm going to show you here the findings of whole grain intake, refined grains, and vegetable consumption. Here we have red meat consumption, processed meat consumption, and consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, and their association with all-cause mortality. It's written down here in the table header. And you can see here, this is the relative risk. We learned that relative risk of 1 says no association with intake. And for the associations between whole grain intake and mortality across those cohort studies, you can see a steady decline. So the higher the whole grain intake, the lower the mortality rate. And you can see very positive associations, also statistically significant with red meat intake. The higher the red meat intake, the higher the mortality risk in all those populations, and the same for processed meat. And this is how we operationalize, at least in nutritional epidemiological studies, the disease risk information and analyze it. The next example I would like to give you, or let's turn to a different one of those other elements of sustainable diets, which is the ecological sustainability. And here we adopt life cycle assessment data. So we have information about systems output, for example, of emissions that are associated with crop, so the life cycle of a food from crop production, processing, packaging, distribution, retail consumption, that can be associated to a given food. And we use for our data the so-called SHARP indicators database that has been composed by a Dutch group. It includes 944 food items and gives information about greenhouse gas emissions and land use associated with those 944 food items. And it has been specifically designed to quantify the environmental impact of the diet in the consumer domain using highly disaggregated food consumption data collected at the individual level. So the important thing is here that it matches actually the level of intake assessment. And using this sharp indicator database analysis permit the comparison of environmental intake of individuals' diets within and between populations if using comparable dietary assessment methods. Now, this is always something that has to be taken into account, that we work with a similar kind of origin of the dietary data. We have adopted this, adopted this database and linked it to the food intake of the Donald study. So this is an analysis that goes back to a study including 856 adolescents, 6 to 17-year-olds, that kept annual 3-day weight dietary records. We have a total of 5,510 records over a 20-year period. So these data go onto this analysis that I'm going to show you here. And we could show and kind of confirm what we expected, that the greenhouse gas emissions in the diet as well as the land use largely go back to the consumption of meat product, followed by the consumption of dairy products. When we look at water use per day, we find the most important food groups as non-alcoholic beverages, followed also by meat, followed by vegetables and fruits. And we want to look a little bit into further characteristics of those diets. And here you find categories: greenhouse gas emissions, tertile 1, tertile 2, tertile 3. So diets with lowest greenhouse gas emissions and diets with highest greenhouse gas emissions in that same study. And the same for water use from tertile 1, tertile 2, tertile 3. And you can see here that when we look at the protein intake in terms of energy percentage, so percentage of energy consumed in terms of protein, you can see that the value increases with diets with higher greenhouse gas emissions, which is basically what we expect, because we know that animal products are origins of protein in the diets, and those animal products are also those that are linked to higher greenhouse gas emissions. And when you look at the ratio between animal and plant-based protein in the diets, you can also see that it increases with the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the diets, and the same we also see for the water use. And we now want to compare two different elements, and here we look at the greenhouse gas emissions of those diets. It's the same study. We have greenhouse gas emissions, land use, and water use calculated per 1,000 kilocalories. And now we look at the nutrients, and the PR is the ratio of animal to plant-based protein. And more interesting now is the mean adequacy ratio and the mean adequacy risk ratio. So composite measures judging the nutrient adequacy of the diets. And what we also expected here is the ratio of the diets positively is associated, the ratio of animal to plant-based protein is positively associated with greenhouse gas emissions and land use. That's what we expected. It's inversely, though not significantly, associated with water use. However, we also find positive associations with our adequacy risk ratios with greenhouse gas emissions and land use, and also a little bit stronger also with water use, showing us that with the higher greenhouse gas emissions of the diets, the risk of meeting all the nutrients is lower. And this shows us that we need to address the composition of the specific diets in very much detail. And it's not only about leaving out animal products in the diet, but it's about specific decisions on what to consume instead to be able to meet all the nutrients requirements. I've shown you a little bit now about the sustainability of individual diets, measuring single aspects, so nutrient adequacy, risk of chronic diseases, or ecological sustainable indicators through life cycle assessment data. What we can also do in our studies is we can work with dietary pattern analysis. And to give you an idea of what a dietary pattern is, it integrates the food consumption on another level. you heard we address the food consumption in our assessment instrument. So we inquire about which kind of food did you eat, either during the past 12 months and how often, or on a given day with weighing it in a prospective manner. And then we connect those data to food composition tables to derive the nutrient intake. But we can kind of integrate this information also upstream to come up with something like dietary patterns. The Mediterranean diet, for example, or also the planetary health diet. Or the Western diet. This is also a pattern that might be familiar to some of you. And here we have a number of methods, and we kind of categorize into the use of a priori information, so hypothesis-based dietary pattern analysis, or as a posteriori method, so exploratory dietary pattern analysis, where we analyze the dietary intake data that we have at hand in an exploratory manner. But what I want to show you today is an attempt of an hypothesis-based dietary pattern that addresses sustainability components. So the idea is that we have an hypothesis or an idea about what is a sustainable diet, and we address in our study by using an index or a scoring method how much or how many of the participants adhere to the diets and in what way those participants adhere to the diet recommendation. I'd like to give you one example here. It's on the next slide, actually. But when you have those hypotheses, you can have those hypotheses addressing a number of dimensions of the sustainable diet. So either only the health dimension. The example is a planetary diet or plant-based dietary index that you find in the literature, or addressing the health and the environment component, which is the planetary health diet index as an example. And there are a few examples in the literature that also address more than the environmental and the health component. And the example I would like to give you is the planetary health diet index. It's also called the Lancet diet score and goes back to a recommended dietary intake that was published in the year 2019 as the Lancet reference diet, or as said now also called the planetary health diet. And here the investigators took into account known associations between food intake and disease risk, and also known associations between food production and consumption and environmental outcomes like greenhouse gas emissions and land use. And they derived kind of a dietary recommendation, quantitative on a given day. So recommended to consume potatoes and cassavas as 50 grams per day with a range of 0 to 100 grams for a 2,500 kilocalorie diet. And if you have recommendations like this is kind of your hypothesis. You can derive dietary index scores, pointing out or counting how many of those recommendations have been adhered to by your study population. And we did that in the Donald study in an age group of adolescents. And you can see that here, the age at first assessment is about 15 years and the age at outcome 18 years. So we talk about a study population between 15 and 18 years. And we used a score that had components, that had a range of components between 0 and 18 based on that Lancet reference diet. And I just want to point you to those two lines here, the dietary intake score. This is the Lancet reference score for males and females in the study population. So the lowest adherence was 7 index points, and the highest adherence was 14 index points for the males. And the females were a little bit higher with the highest index points. So 15 was the highest point and 6 was the lowest point. So there was some variation. And this is tertiles of the diet index score. And now we did compare the adherence to those tertiles of the dietary index to the greenhouse gas emissions and land use, so the environmental indicators, and could show that those diets that adhere highest to the Lancet reference recommendations were lowest in greenhouse gas emissions, and they were also lowest in land use associated with those diets. And then we could further explore, please excuse the busy table, more about the nutritional characteristics of those diets. And let me just point out a few nutrients here. Here we have total fiber and the tertiles of the dietary index score. And we could see that the higher the adherence to the score, the higher the total dietary fiber intake. We also have animal proteins here, that's this line. So we could also show that the higher the adherence to the diet, the lower the animal protein intake, and the plant protein intake increases. Let me show you this line here, from 12.8 gram to 14.2 gram per 1,000 kilocalories, which was also statistically significant. And with this, I would like to summarize. There are different ways to operationalize the concept of sustainable diets and nutrition studies. They largely depend on the research question, which kind of elements you want to address and which interactions you want to look at. They also largely depend on the dietary assessment instrument and the data at hand. The concept of sustainable diets has a number of elements, some of which can be better operationalized in nutrition studies than others, because the data are not regularly assessed in all the studies. Nutrition sciences generally has good means to analyze the disease risk and the aspects of nutrient adequacy. Here we could also address levels or studies on the biomarker level, which I did not address in my talk here. Nowadays, we can link the food intake on the item level to life cycle assessment databases, which is helpful to estimate the ecological footprints of diets. And the dietary pattern analysis can be a useful method in this context to address sustainability of diets. Thank you very much.